I refused to name my baby after my mother-in-law, so she tried to steal my child, and then I. The night before I was scheduled to bring our daughter into the world, I found myself sitting across from my husband's mother in her immaculate dining room, her wine glass barely touched, her fingers interlocked like she was presiding over some final judgment. I was 9 months pregnant, swollen and aching, unable to sleep longer than 20 minutes without waking up from a kick or a sharp stab of back pain. And Inez, yes, that was her name, chose that exact moment to drop a threat disguised as a gift. She looked me straight in the eye, her voice so calm it made my skin crawl, and said, "You're going to name the baby after me. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." I remember thinking she was joking, just some twisted sense of humor that ran in her bloodline. But the way her mouth stayed perfectly still, no hint of a smile, told me otherwise. I laughed anyway, awkward and hollow, because when a woman who still refers to herself as a former Miss California finalist says something like that, you really want it to be a joke. Derek, my husband, stood nearby, sipping iced tea like he wasn't 3 feet away from an emotional grenade. He gave me a shrug, said something like, "She's just being sweet in her own intense way," and then went back to helping his dad sort through a busted air purifier in the garage. I couldn't tell if he was stupid or spineless, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. If he didn't have the backbone to say something now, what the hell was he going to do once this baby came? I looked back at Inez, smiled the fakest damn smile I've ever forced across my face, and said, "Then you'll both really love the name I picked out." Her eyes narrowed, but I didn't stick around long enough to give her a reply. I stood up, my lower back screaming, and waddled out to the car alone. Derek followed a minute later asking what that was about, and I told him I was too tired to talk, which was true, but the real reason was if I opened my mouth, I would have screamed. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Not because of the baby or the usual aches or the anxiety that always creeps in before life-changing events, but because I couldn't get the image of Inez's face out of my head, that smug, controlling glint in her eye, like she believed she was the one giving birth. Like the baby inside me was hers, just passing through me like a surrogate she hadn't even paid. She thought legacy meant naming rights, and Derek, my own husband, was just going to let her take that moment from me? I went into labor less than 12 hours later. I barely remember the drive to the hospital or checking in, only the long, slow burn of each contraction and the way Derek kept glancing at his phone like he had somewhere better to be. Hours passed in a blur of IVs, nurses, deep breaths, and raw pain. And through it all, one thing became blindingly clear. There was no way I was going to name my daughter after that woman. I'd rather carve the name into my own arm before letting her own a single syllable of my child's identity. A few months before all this, I discovered a box of old letters and journals in my mom's attic, keepsakes from my great-grandmother, a woman I barely remembered but whose words hit like a freight train. Her name was Maribel June, and she had walked away from an abusive husband in 1947, with 2 kids and no money, and rebuild a life no one thought she could. I read every one of her letters like scripture, soaking in the fire she carried, and made a quiet promise that if I had a daughter, I'd name her after the only woman in my bloodline who'd ever defied expectations instead of living to meet them. So when the nurse asked for the birth certificate information, I didn't hesitate. Her name is Maribel June, and she's not anybody's second act. Later that afternoon, while I was still stitched and sore and trying to breastfeed with cracked nipples and shaking hands, Inez walked into the hospital room like she owned the building. Her heels clicked against the tile, her perfume hit me like a brick wall, and her eyes went straight to the cradle. She hovered over the baby without asking to hold her, and when I handed her the little name card, she read it aloud like the words offended her. "Maribel?" she said, blinking hard. "Who the hell is Maribel?" I smiled. "My great-grandmother," I said, voice calm but sharp. "She was a survivor, not a narcissist." I thought that was a better story to pass on. She looked over at Derek, waiting for him to intervene. He didn't even meet her eyes. He just stared at the floor like a scolded child. That was the moment something cracked in her. Her entire face twisted, lips curling like she'd bitten a lemon soaked in gasoline. She leaned in close and said, You'll regret this. I said, I already regret letting you within 5 feet of my daughter. That was the last civil word exchange between us. I wish I could say it ended there, that a woman like her would accept the defeat, slink away, and lick her wounds in silence. But I should have known better. I should have known that with people like Inez, the loss isn't just bruising. It's personal, nuclear, and they always come back with fire. For about 4 days after I came home from the hospital, there was a strange and almost eerie quiet, like the calm before some awful storm I could feel building behind the walls. Derek was half present, bouncing between exhaustion and distraction, and I was trying to learn how to function on 2 hours of sleep while figuring out how to breastfeed without wincing in pain every 10 seconds. Maribel cried like clockwork, as if born with a natural sense of timing, and though my body ached like hell, I was starting to feel this deep-rooted calm, like I was finally becoming the person I was supposed to be. Then, without warning, that silence shattered at 9:17 in the morning when I heard the front door open. Not a knock, not a doorbell, not even a text. The door literally opened like it belonged to her, and I will never forget the way my stomach dropped when I realized I was home alone with the baby, Derek having gone to pick up groceries. I held Maribel tighter and peeked out of the nursery, and there she was, Inez, walking into my house with her purse slung over one shoulder, completely at ease like she'd been invited, like she had some God-given right to enter unannounced. I called out, "How the hell did you get in here?" And she gave me this bright, artificial smile that made my teeth clench, holding up a spare key like she'd just won a prize. "Derek gave me a copy months ago," she said, like that made it better. "I thought I'd surprise you and help out with the baby." My blood turned into steam. I looked down at my daughter, still cradled in my arms, and knew with certainty that I couldn't let this woman have even 1 inch of control. "You need to leave," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady, and she gave me that little laugh she always uses when she wants to sound amused, but really just means disrespect. "Oh, don't be silly. I'm family. I have every right to be here." I remembered something my old therapist once told me about people who thrive off chaos. They don't know how to survive in peace, so they stir the pot just to feel alive. I took a deep breath, looked her right in the eye, and said, "If you're going to be here, then you follow my rules. Rule number 1, you do not touch my daughter without asking." She rolled her eyes and muttered something like, "I'm her grandmother, not a stranger off the street." But she didn't reach for Maribel again, so I counted that as a win, small as it was. The next few days were an exercise in restraint, because Inez kept showing up like she lived 3 houses down instead of 25 minutes away, each visit more invasive than the last. She criticized everything, from the way I held the baby to the brand of diapers we used to the fact that I wouldn't let her post pictures of Maribel online. She brought these hideous baby clothes, all glitter and bows and frills, like she thought we were dressing a pageant doll and not a newborn. One of the onesies, no joke, had named after Grandma stitched across the chest in metallic pink thread. That went straight into the donation box the minute she left. Derek, as always, stayed on the sidelines, mumbling things like, "She just wants to be involved," or "She's trying," in her own way. And every time he said that, I wanted to scream. I asked him point blank, "Do I matter? Does what I want for our daughter matter to you at all?" He looked genuinely confused, like he'd never considered that question before in his life. He told me I was being dramatic, that it was a misunderstanding, that Inez only wanted to help. That's when I stopped talking and started planning. First, I changed the locks and didn't say a damn word about it to anyone. Second, I bought a nanny cam disguised as a decorative clock and set it up in the living room where Inez usually sat. Third, I waited for the perfect moment. A week later, I told Derek I was feeling exhausted and needed a nap, asked if he could keep an eye on the baby. Instead, I took Maribel and went to my best friend Celia's place across town. I left a note on the counter that said I'd be back in a few hours. Derek didn't ask any questions, too caught up in whatever distracted fog he lived in these days. Sure enough, Inez showed up. She used her hidden key to get in, because of course she'd made a copy without telling us, and walked straight into the house like she owned it. What she didn't know was that I was watching the whole thing from Celia's couch on my laptop. She didn't call out, didn't text, or check to see if anyone was home. She just wandered the house, went into the nursery, saw the crib was empty, and then, this is where it gets dark, started going through our drawers. Our kitchen, our bedroom, my nightstand. She found my prescription bottle for postpartum anxiety and literally held it up to the light, took a photo with her phone, and muttered, "Maybe this'll help me prove she's not stable enough to raise a child." I was shaking. Celia had to hold my arm to stop me from throwing my laptop across the room. She wasn't just being invasive. She was actively trying to set me up, to collect fake evidence and build some twisted narrative that I wasn't fit to be a mother, that she could somehow manipulate her way into control over Maribel through court or guilt or both. I called my lawyer friend again, told him everything, showed him the footage. He told me one thing: document everything. Don't confront yet. Build a case. The next day, I handed Inez a USB drive when she showed up again. "What's this?" she asked, already suspicious. I looked her in the eye and said, "Footage of you breaking into my house, rummaging through my personal things, and trying to paint me as unstable." She went pale, opened her mouth, probably to deny it, but I raised my hand to stop her. "If you ever enter this house again without permission, I will file for a restraining order so fast your pearls will snap. And if you try to go behind my back one more time, I'll make sure every person in this family knows exactly who you are." She tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear beneath the surface. That same night, Derek lost his mind. He yelled at me for being cruel, said I was destroying his family, like the footage of his mother breaking and entering was just a minor inconvenience. I looked him in the eye and said, "No, Derek, your mother is destroying this family. And if you can't see that, maybe you should go stay with her for a while." He packed a bag and left for 2 nights. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I had Maribel, and she was more than enough. When he came back, he looked hollowed out, like the truth had finally started to carve itself into his bones. He sat on the couch, eyes red, and said, "I watched the video. I didn't want to believe it, but now I do." He paused, then said the one sentence I'd been waiting months to hear: "I want to go no contact." And just like that, I thought maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. But I was wrong. Inez was far from finished. She'd barely started. For a while, after Derek finally admitted what his mother had done and said he wanted to cut ties with her completely, I let myself believe we were turning a corner, like we could maybe start to rebuild something stronger from the rubble she'd left behind. He deleted her number, blocked her on social media, and told her through email that she was no longer welcome in our lives or near our daughter. For the first time since I'd given birth, I slept more than 3 hours in a row without jolting awake, heart pounding, expecting her to burst through the door. But of course, peace doesn't last long with someone like Inez, because she doesn't know how to lose, only how to retaliate. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on the living room floor with Maribel, trying to get her to do tummy time without screaming like I was torturing her, when the doorbell rang. I froze for a second, instinctively bracing for disaster, but when I opened the door, it wasn't Inez. It was a woman holding a clipboard, flashing a badge that made my stomach go cold. She introduced herself as a caseworker from Child Protective Services, said they had received an anonymous report alleging mental instability, unsafe living conditions, and emotional neglect. I almost laughed from the shock, but instead I invited her in, heart beating so hard I could barely hear her explanation. She was calm, professional, and thank God, not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions. I showed her everything: the clean bottles, the safe crib, the baby monitor, the perfectly organized changing station. I pulled out my medical records, receipts from doctor visits, Maribel's vaccination schedule, even the footage from the nanny cam showing how Inez had broken in without permission. The caseworker took it all in, asked a few gentle questions, then lowered her voice and said, "I'm very sorry you had to go through this. I can tell this report was retaliatory. I'll be closing the case immediately, but I do recommend you speak with an attorney. This could escalate." She was right, because just when I thought Inez had run out of moves, she pulled something so deranged it almost felt like satire. A week after the CPS visit, I got a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, but a real physical letter, neatly typed, printed on official-looking stationery from the Oakdale Women's Medical Center, which was where I'd had my prenatal care. The letter said they had serious concerns about my postpartum mental health and were recommending a psychiatric evaluation under medical hold. I sat on the couch for a full minute, rereading it, my hands trembling, because on the surface, it looked legitimate. The logo was right, the address matched, and it even had my OB's signature at the bottom. But I knew it wasn't real. 2 days earlier, I'd had a routine checkup, and my doctor had literally hugged me on the way out, told me I was doing a great job, and not to let anyone make me question that. I called the clinic immediately, spoke to the front desk, then emailed a scanned copy of the letter to their office manager. An hour later, I got a call from the clinic director herself, voice tight with fury. She told me that the letterhead had been copied from their website, the wording was fabricated, and the signature was forged. This was not sent by anyone here, she said. We will be launching an internal investigation, and you should consider reporting this to the police. So I did. I filed a police report for document forgery, and then I went back to my lawyer friend, who by now had a whole folder dedicated to Inez, and showed him everything. He looked over the forged letter, shook his head, and said something I still think about. She's not just trying to hurt you anymore. She's building something bigger, and I don't think she's doing it alone. I didn't understand what he meant at first, not until a week later, when a court summons showed up at our front door. I remember the way my knees buckled as I read it. Emergency petition for visitation and temporary custody rights filed by Inez, citing claims that I had mentally manipulated Derek, isolated Maribel, and created an environment of emotional abuse. She wasn't just trying to scare me now. She was trying to take my child. Attached to the petition were pages of evidence, fake text conversations supposedly between me and Derek that made it look like I was threatening to cut him off from his family if he didn't obey me. More forged messages showing me complaining about being a mother, and, of course, the fake letter from my OB, which she'd now presented as medical proof of my instability. It was all so carefully staged, and yet so obviously fake if you knew what to look for. But the terrifying part was knowing that sometimes, if you lie big enough, someone in a courtroom might just believe you. I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. I wanted to scream, to break something, but instead, I went into what I can only describe as survival mode. I started collecting everything. Every email Inez had sent me, every recorded conversation from the nanny cam, every voicemail, every screenshot of the nasty things she'd texted when she thought she wasn't being watched. I backed up the footage of her breaking into our home, opening my drawers, photographing my medication. I even printed out the fake onesie she gave us that said, "Named after Grandma," as part of a pattern of delusional entitlement. I wrote a detailed statement, attached time-stamped metadata from every file, and included testimony from the clinic director who had confirmed the forged letter. Derek, to his credit, finally stepped up. For the first time in our relationship, he didn't try to stay neutral or minimize the damage. He wrote a declaration stating clearly that Inez was unstable, that he fully supported me, and that the accusations against me were lies. He didn't get poetic, didn't pour out his soul, but he said the truth, and I knew that mattered more than anything. The 3 weeks leading up to the court hearing were the longest of my life. Every knock on the door sent my heart racing. Every time I opened my phone, I expected to see another ambush. I barely slept, barely ate, just kept organizing documents and playing scenarios in my head. On the day of the hearing, I wore black, not because I thought it made me look strong, but because I was mourning the loss of any illusion that this woman could be reasoned with. Inez showed up in a pale blue dress and a string of pearls, looking like she was headed to some southern brunch, not a legal proceeding to steal her granddaughter. She smiled like she was already celebrating, sat down with her lawyer, a woman who looked equally uncomfortable, and didn't even glance in our direction. When the judge walked in, the air shifted. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom, nothing like in the movies, just a plain room with gray carpet and heavy silence. We presented our case first. My lawyer walked the judge through the timeline, piece by piece, starting with the nanny cam footage, then the CPS visit, then the forged letter, all neatly printed and bound with accompanying screenshots. When the clinic director testified, live, in person, that the letter had been fabricated and that they were pursuing their own legal investigation into the forgery, the judge's eyebrows lifted for the first time. When our tech expert explained how he traced the Word document's metadata back to an email address tied directly to Inez, including the exact time and date it had been created, you could feel the room shift. Her lawyer started whispering frantically, but the judge wasn't listening to her anymore. When it was Inez's turn to speak, she stood and started to unravel. She didn't stick to the script. She cried, ranted, pointed at me, and shouted that I'd stolen her son and turned her grandchild into a weapon. The judge raised a hand and told her to sit down twice before finally signaling for security when she refused. She was escorted out of the room, still yelling, still convinced she was the victim. The judge turned to me and said, "Your documentation is thorough and compelling. This is not just an overstep. It is a campaign of harassment and deception. You will receive full custody, and I am issuing a no-contact order effective immediately. If the petitioner attempts any form of communication or contact, notify the court and law enforcement." I walked out of that courtroom with my daughter's safety secured by law. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the final chapter. With someone like Inez, nothing is ever finished. It just moves underground. And sure enough, within a week, the next wave began, and this time, it came from someone I didn't even know existed. For a week after the court hearing, I told myself it was over. I told myself that the paperwork was enough, the judge's words were enough, and that maybe finally, Inez would take the loss and disappear into whatever dark corner narcissists go to when the spotlight finally burns out. Maribel was sleeping better, eating better, and I even found myself laughing again. Small laughs at first, quiet ones, but they were real. Derek and I didn't talk much about what happened, which I took as a sign that he was finally processing everything in his own way, letting the weight of it all sink into his bones the way it had already settled into mine. But as always, I should have known better than to assume silence meant surrender. The first sign came in the form of a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize at all, a woman named Delilah who claimed to be Inez's sister. I didn't even know Inez had a sister. The message started out gentle, apologetic even, telling me that she was sorry for everything that had happened, that she'd heard Inez had gone too far, and that she hoped, in time, I could find a way to forgive. I didn't answer. I wasn't in the mood for more back-channel manipulation. I thought that would be the end of it. 3 days later, a letter arrived at our door, handwritten in cursive so polished it looked like it came from a historical reenactor. It was from Delilah again. Only this time the tone was very different. She said Inez was spiraling, that she was depressed, lost, and grieving, and that the only thing she wanted before she lost everything was to see her granddaughter one time. One time. That phrase was underlined 3 times in red ink, and I swear to God, I felt my spine stiffen as I read it. There was something about that particular phrase, the calculated pleading of it, that sounded exactly like Inez. I don't know if she dictated the letter or Delilah just carried her voice like a puppet, but I could feel her behind every word. I sat on the floor next to Maribel's crib and stared at the page for a long time, the house quiet except for the soft rhythm of the baby monitor. For the first time in months, I felt something other than rage or fear. I felt tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from knowing the war was never going to end. Not really. I folded the letter and burned it in the sink. That night, I told Derek I was done. Done with his family. Done pretending that these people could ever be part of our lives again. And done offering chances to people who only used them as opportunities to sharpen the next knife. I said that if anyone from that side ever contacted me again, I would file for harassment without hesitation. He nodded quietly, but there was something off about him, something I couldn't place, like he was holding something in, like there was a truth pressing against his ribcage, and he didn't know how to say it out loud. Over the next couple weeks, I noticed him pulling away. At first I told myself it was stress, the fallout from everything we'd gone through, but it was more than that. He was distant, distracted, always on his phone but never talking, his expression unreadable. I tried to ask once what was going on, but he brushed me off with some vague answer about work stress. Then one night, while he was in the shower and his phone lit up on the nightstand, I did something I'd never done before, not because I was proud of it, but because I needed to know. I picked up the phone. The most recent message was from Delilah. She still doesn't know. My stomach dropped. I scrolled up and found dozens of messages. They dated back weeks, all the way to before the court hearing. Derek had been in contact with both Inez and Delilah the entire time, feeding them information, sharing updates about our case, repeating things I said in private like some kind of spy reporting back to headquarters. He told them what our lawyers said, what documents we were submitting, even how angry I was behind closed doors. He hadn't just stayed in touch, he had helped them, enabled them, protected them. One message from him read, "I think she's overreacting, but I have to support her." Overreacting. Overreacting to being stalked, manipulated, forged against, taken to court over my own child? When he stepped out of the bathroom, steam trailing behind him like a ghost, I was standing there with his phone in my hand. His face went pale. I said nothing at first, just held up the screen. "You lied to me," I said finally, voice low but shaking. "You told me you were done with them. You told me you were on my side." He started to stammer something about peacekeeping, about trying to calm them down, about how he didn't give them everything, just enough to keep things civil. I wanted to scream. "You gave them ammunition. You helped them build a case against me. You told them exactly how to hurt me." He had no answer. That night, I packed a bag for Maribel and me. I didn't wait for a fight. I didn't want an explanation. I sent a short message the next morning from my sister's place in another city, 3 hours away. "You need to decide if you're going to be a husband and a father or your mother's puppet." He didn't respond for 2 days. When he did, it was an email. Short, cold, final. "I'm sorry. I love you both. But she's still my mom." That was it. That was the end. I filed for full custody the next morning. I didn't ask for child support. I didn't want shared holidays or supervised visits. I wanted freedom. I wanted peace. I had a folder thick enough to bury him if he ever contested it. Footage, declarations, betrayal in black and white. And when the court granted me everything I asked for, I didn't cry. I just felt the weight start to lift, piece by piece. A week later, I got another letter. This time it was typed. At the bottom was a Bible verse about forgiveness, underlined in thick red ink. I didn't even finish reading it. Another arrived a few days later, saying, "One day, Maribel will ask why she doesn't know her grandmother. I'll tell her the truth." So I did something she didn't expect. I printed everything. Every letter. Every screenshot. Every forged message. Every photo. I burned copies onto a drive and put it all into a sealed folder, labeled in block letters. The truth about Inez. It's locked away in a fireproof box, and one day, when my daughter is old enough to ask the hard questions, I will tell her everything. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of truth. Because people like Inez count on silence. They count on time to blur the edges, rewrite the script, become the victims in stories they twisted themselves. But this time, I've written it all down. Every last word. And this time, she won't get the final say. 3 years have passed since the last letter from Inez came through our door, the one wrapped in a Bible verse and false remorse, and not a single moment of it has faded in my mind. That woman burned herself into our lives like a wildfire no one wanted, and I used to worry that no amount of distance or time would ever be enough to make her disappear. But now, 3 years later, I see it differently. I see that what I built from those ashes is something stronger, quieter, and far more powerful than anything she ever tried to control. Maribel is 4 now, bright, fearless, hilarious in ways I never saw coming. She runs headfirst into the world like it's a game she's determined to win. And there are moments when I watch her jumping through the grass or asking why clouds don't fall out of the sky. And I remember how terrified I used to be that her first memories would be shaped by chaos, by lies, by fear disguised as family. But she doesn't remember Inez. She doesn't remember Derek either. Their names mean nothing to her because I made sure she grew up surrounded by truth and not mythology. I didn't speak to Derek again after the court ruling. The last I heard, he'd moved to Arkansas with Delilah, and within a few months, he'd signed over his parental rights completely. No legal obligation, no visitation, not even a request for updates. He did it to avoid paying anything, which told me everything I still needed to know about who he really was. I thought it would hurt more than it did, but instead, all I felt was the final click of a lock turning behind me, one that sealed a door I never had to walk through again. I could have stayed bitter, let that part of me fester into something cold, but I didn't. Instead, I started rebuilding, slowly at first, one day at a time. I moved back to a smaller town near where my sister lived in northern Washington, started teaching again part-time at a local school, and began reconnecting with people I'd pushed away during the chaos. For a long time, I thought I would never trust anyone again, that I'd always be waiting for the next betrayal around every corner. But healing is sneaky like that. It happens while you're doing the dishes or tying your kids' shoes or laughing unexpectedly at something dumb on TV. A year after the custody hearing, I met someone. His name's Carson. I didn't mean for it to happen. It started with a conversation at the town library, of all places, over a misplaced copy of The Little Prince. He wasn't flashy or dramatic, just steady and kind and patient in the kind of way that made me suspicious at first, because I'd forgotten what calm even looked like in a man. He never asked for anything big, never tried to fix me, never tried to prove anything. He just showed up, again and again, until one day I realized I wasn't checking the exits anymore. I could exhale around him. We've been married for almost 8 months now. It's simple, nothing like the mess I left behind. He builds furniture from scratch in a small shop off Main Street, and plays the piano when he thinks no one's listening. He calls Maribel his girl, even though there's no blood between them, and she adores him in that loud, possessive way 4-year-olds love someone who makes them feel safe. He never asks about Derek, never presses for the whole story. He knows there's a folder in the house labeled The Truth About Inez, and he knows I'll open it for Maribel one day when she's ready. But he also knows that we live in the now, not the wreckage of before. As for Inez, well, karma works with the slow patience of a glacier. I heard from an old friend of Derek's that she ended up being sued by her church after forging another document. Something about a fake financial hardship appeal to access restricted donation funds. She was caught, charged, and lost the last job she had in a nonprofit office that dealt with senior services. Apparently, she now lives in a converted trailer on the outskirts of Dallas, telling anyone who'll listen that her evil daughter-in-law kidnapped her only grandchild. She leaves out the parts about forged letters, court lies, and breaking into my house like a soap opera villain. I guess that's how she sleeps at night. I sleep fine. Sometimes I sleep deeply enough that I forget there was ever a time when I woke up to check the locks twice, just in case. I dream now, not about fear or courtrooms or betrayal, but about things like soft grass, road trips, Maribel's first day of school, and what color paint to pick for our kitchen. It's not dramatic. It's not some perfect movie ending. But it's mine. It's quiet, and it's earned. And even though I never named my daughter after Inez, never etched that entitled name onto a birth certificate like she demanded, I gave Maribel a name that came from someone with real strength, someone who didn't fake her legacy, but built it brick by brick. I named her after a survivor, a woman who escaped the impossible and still stood tall. And sometimes, when Maribel looks at me and says, "Mama, tell me a story about when I was a baby," I smile, and I start to tell her, not all of it yet, but enough. I don't tell her about court summonses or hidden keys or threats whispered over wine. I tell her that once, when she was still inside me, there were people who tried to name her before she was even born, who tried to decide who she'd be before she had the chance to breathe. But I didn't let them. I chose her name. I chose her story, and I will keep choosing her again and again, every single day, for the rest of my life. Because that's what mothers do, not the ones who parade themselves through hospital rooms like queens without crowns, but the ones who stay when it's ugly and fight when it's thankless and refuse to hand over their children to anyone who thinks blood entitles them to control. So no, Inez never got the name. She never got the visit. She never got the story she wanted to tell her church friends or spin into a tearful performance at whatever senior potluck still tolerates her. She got exactly what she deserved, nothing. and I got everything I needed. Peace. A daughter who laughs like a thunderclap. A partner who doesn't flinch when I fall apart. And a truth that can't be rewritten, no matter how many times she tries. That's how the story ends. Not with vengeance. Not with chaos. But with me sitting on the porch of a quiet home, holding a cup of tea while my daughter draws sidewalk chalk dragons at my feet, the sky turning gold above us, and the name I chose for her echoing in the wind like a promise I kept.